In 2019, I donated blood on a Thursday afternoon and walked away with a sticker and a juice box. By Monday night, I'd received an email that unraveled everything I thought I knew about myself. At the time, I lived in Asheville, North Carolina, above a used bookstore that smelled like cedar and dust. The kind of place where nothing ever really changes, even when it should. And for most of my life, I thought that was a good thing. Before I go any further, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and if you've ever brushed up against a story like this in your own town or your own life. Tap that like and subscribe to help bring more forgotten names back into the light. I'm Owen Rourke. I was 27 back then, working tech support at a startup built inside a converted tire warehouse. The building still creaked like it remembered what it used to be. My job was simple. Keep the machines running, fix what broke, stay invisible. I liked that. I liked quiet routines, morning coffee from the same corner cart, Thursday tacos with coworkers I barely knew, and Sunday dinners with Claire, the woman who raised me. Claire had a way of making everything seem stable. She was neat without being cold, firm, but gentle. She kept photo albums and old greeting cards in color-coded bins, folded her towels in perfect thirds, and never once raised her voice. She told me once that my father had died in a car wreck before I was born, and that a house fire when I was 6 had taken all the baby photos. I didn't question it. I mean, why would I? Some stories are told so often they start to sound like facts. Looking back now, there were things that didn't line up. Little gaps. Like how we moved 4 times before I turned 10, or how there were no birthday pictures before 2nd grade. No baby clothes. No hospital bracelets. Just school portraits starting in 1st grade, and one framed photo of Claire holding me by a lake. Her smile stiff, my eyes a little too wide. It never stood out as strange, not until later. Claire worked as a legal assistant most of my childhood. She kept our world tight. No sleepovers, no long vacations, no digging into the past. When I'd ask about my dad, she'd say, "It doesn't help to stir up what we can't fix." I took her word for it. We weren't close, but she was there. When I got the flu in 9th grade, she sat by my bed all night. She packed lunch every school day until I graduated. She taught me how to drive, how to parallel park, how to write thank you notes. She was consistent. But consistency has a funny way of masking things. You stop looking for answers when everything stays in its place. That year, I lived alone in a cramped 2nd-floor apartment over the bookstore. The floors groaned, the pipes knocked at night, but it felt like mine. Quiet, predictable, safe. Until that Thursday afternoon. I just finished a project and stepped outside for air when I saw the mobile blood drive van parked at the curb. A big red and white sign leaned against the cone out front, "Donate today. Help save lives." All donors entered into National Ancestry Study. I'd never donated before. I hated needles. But something about that word ancestry stuck to me like a burr. I walked in half joking with the nurse about passing out, signed my name, rolled up my sleeve, didn't think much of it after that. But that night as I stood by my apartment window with the rain just starting to fall, I felt off. The sky was that weird purple-gray color that makes everything look faded. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, but it didn't feel like mine. And when I went to close the curtain, I could have sworn I saw someone standing down in the alley. Just still, watching. By the time I looked again, there was no one there. But I remember the chill climbing up my spine, like something old had just started to wake up. And that was before the email came in. The email came in just after 9 while I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, still half listening to the rain outside. The subject line was simple, genetic match notification, but the sentence inside it was what stopped me cold. A close biological relative has been identified. Authorities have been notified. I read it once, then again, and then a third time, like repetition might make it make sense. The message wasn't long. No attachments, no names, no explanations. Just that one quiet line. And for the first time in years, I realized I had no idea what that meant for me, for Claire, or for the life I'd built around her story. I stayed up most of the night, not moving much, just sitting by the window with the lights off, watching the traffic pass below and trying to remember anything about my own childhood that didn't come from her mouth. That's when I remembered the stars, those cheap, glow-in-the-dark ceiling stickers shaped like constellations. It wasn't a memory so much as a flicker. A room, blue walls, a spinning ceiling fan, the sound of someone humming. I couldn't place the voice, but the tune turned my stomach. Like something meant to soothe me had once done the opposite. I chalked it up to nerves. The mind filling gaps. But the feeling stuck. The next morning, I opened my laptop and typed out 3 searches in a row. What happens when DNA matches a missing person? Can someone be raised without knowing they were kidnapped? How do you know if your life is real? I didn't like any of the answers. Most of the links were just forum posts or news blurbs that ended in lawsuits or custody battles. But one stuck out, a government page buried under layers of links about how DNA from voluntary health screenings is sometimes cross-checked against the National Missing Persons Registry. It didn't mention how often or how accurate or what someone like me was supposed to do next. I shut the laptop and sat still until my phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice was calm, maybe a little more careful than usual. She asked if I could stop by that afternoon to help move a few boxes in the garage. Something about reorganizing old storage. I said sure, and she thanked me like it was any other day. But something in the way she said the word garage made me pause after we hung up. Like it came out a little too smooth, like she'd rehearsed it. Claire's house sat on the west side of town, just past a quiet strip of dogwood trees and tidy yards with matching mailboxes. The wind chimes on her porch were still the same ones from my childhood metal tubes that always sounded slightly off-key, like they were never quite tuned to anything. She opened the door with a half smile and said I looked pale. I told her I hadn't slept. She didn't ask why. She never really did. The garage was cramped, the air stale with dust and something that smelled faintly like mothballs. Boxes were stacked along the back wall, most of them labeled in her clean block handwriting, XMAS Kitchen Old Files. But one stood out. It wasn't labeled at all. The cardboard was worn, slightly caved in at one side, the tape brittle and curling at the edges. Claire moved toward the others, talking about needing to make space for winter things, but I stayed where I was. "What's in this one?" I asked. She didn't look, just said it was probably junk from her aunt's place. Nothing important, but the box wasn't dusty. It had been moved recently. I opened it slowly. Inside were loose items, most of them unremarkable faded receipts, a torn paperback, a couple of old candles. But near the bottom was a small shoe, a child's sneaker, blue with Velcro straps worn smooth at the toe like someone had dragged their foot across pavement again and again. I picked it up. The size, the shape, it wasn't recent. Not from anyone Claire would have babysat in the last few years. "Whose was this?" I asked. She turned halfway, then froze. "One of the kids I watched," she said after a moment, but her voice cracked just slightly on watched. "I don't remember." She did. I could see it. That night I sat on the floor of my apartment with that shoe beside me and the framed photo of Claire and me from the lake in my lap, the one she always kept in the hallway. I flipped it over. On the back in faded ink were 3 words, July 2009. Blue Lake. Then, underneath, just letters, N-O-N. I said them out loud over and over until the sound stopped making sense. I didn't know what they meant yet, but I knew what they didn't say. They didn't say Owen. The next morning felt different. The apartment was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you question if something's missing. I stood at the counter staring at the shoe again, and for the first time, I turned it over. That's when I saw it, carved faintly into the rubber sole, like with a pen or the edge of a key. 2 letters NP. I didn't move for a long time. That wasn't a child's doodle. That was something a parent does before sending their kid to camp or school. Something you do so they don't lose what belongs to them. I didn't recognize the initials, but they felt heavier than any part of my name ever had. Later that day, Carly called. She said she'd had a strange dream about me. Said I was a little boy standing in a blue room under stars crying about something I'd lost but couldn't name. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then I asked real careful, "Did I used to have glow stars in my room?" She laughed a little and said she did, but I was already 6 when we met. "Claire always said you were quiet as a baby," she added like it was meant to reassure me. I didn't tell her that I don't remember being a baby. Not a single thing. Just fog. I spent the afternoon digging through every drawer and closet in that apartment. I wasn't sure what I was even looking for. Some kind of proof that Claire's version of things had been real. Birth certificates, hospital records, something. But there was nothing. No baby book, no hospital bracelets, no photos before elementary school. Nothing with my birth weight or first haircut or doctor's name. Just a gap where the first 6 years of my life were supposed to be. That night I dreamed of water. Not crashing waves or deep oceans, just a lake. Still murky green around the edges. In the dream, someone was holding my wrist, pulling me through it. When I woke up, my wrist throbbed. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and rolled back my sleeve. That's when I saw the scar. Faint, small, circular. Like an old burn. I'd had it for years, but I'd never really thought about it. Never asked where it came from. Claire had once said I'd touched a hot pan. I never questioned that either. The next day I drove back to her house. She wasn't home. The key still worked. I walked inside and went straight for the office. It always smelled like lemon cleaner and old printer ink. Her desk drawer, usually locked, was open. Inside was a stack of papers, bills, letters, notes, but tucked at the back was a folder, old and faded label torn off. Inside was a missing child flyer. Tennessee, July 2006. Name Nathaniel James Pierce. Age 4. Hair light brown. Eyes green. The picture was small, grainy. But I knew that face. Same scar above the eyebrow. Same shape of the chin. Same eyes. Mine. I drove straight to the police station downtown and walked up to the front desk. I didn't explain much. Just said I think I might be a missing person. The woman behind the glass blinked once, then asked me to wait. I sat there for 20 minutes before a detective came out and called my name. He introduced himself as Ray Mendoza and led me into a small room. He didn't smile. He just sat down across from me and said, "Start wherever you need to." So I did. I told him everything I'd found: the shoe, the initials, the photograph, the scar. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he leaned back, looked at the flyer again, then looked at me. "I remember this case," he said. "I was a rookie back then, worked backup on the search team." He paused. "You understand this might take some time to verify?" I nodded. "But if it's true," he added, "we'll find out." Before I left, he took a DNA sample, said it would be expedited. I asked how long. He said a week, maybe less. As I stepped out into the afternoon light, the sky looked wrong again. Too bright, too quiet. And in the middle of all that silence, I realized something else. I hadn't called Claire once that day. And she hadn't called me. Not even to ask where I was. Detective Mendoza called 4 days later. His voice was even practiced, the kind of voice you use when you know something big is about to land. He asked if I could come in that morning, said the results had arrived sooner than expected. I didn't ask what they said. I think part of me already knew. The drive to the station was quiet. Cloudy morning streets still wet from overnight rain, windshield wipers brushing back the same streak of water over and over. I parked, walked in, nodded at the front desk, and followed the same hall to the same small room. Mendoza was already there, sitting with a thin folder in front of him. He didn't open it. He just looked at me and said, "It's a match." I nodded once. Nothing else moved. "Your birth name is Nathaniel James Pierce," he said. "Went missing in July of 2006 from a lake near Cookeville, Tennessee." I kept staring at the table. He gave it a few seconds, then added, "Your biological parents are alive. They live outside Nashville. They've already been contacted." I didn't speak much during that meeting. Mendoza walked me through what would happen next: verification statements, coordination with the Tennessee authorities. No press yet, no photos. They were giving me space to decide how I wanted to handle things. I told him I needed to go home and process. He gave me his card, told me to call any time. On the way out, I passed a bulletin board near the elevator. It was covered in flyers, some new, some yellowed with time. Faces, dates, missing reports. I stood in front of it for longer than I should have, wondering if mine had ever been there. I didn't go straight home. I drove to Claire's. She was on the porch when I pulled up, standing by the railing like she'd been waiting for me. Her hands were wrapped around a mug, but she wasn't drinking. When she saw me step out of the car, she didn't wave. Just stood there, eyes following me until I reached the steps. I didn't ask if I could come in. I just opened the door and walked past her into the house. It smelled like lemon polish and old paper, same as always. I sat down in the living room. She followed and sat across from me without speaking. I held the photo in my hand, the one from the flyer. Nathaniel Pierce, age 4. I didn't push it across the table. I didn't need to. She had already seen it. Her shoulders tightened. After a few seconds, I asked, "Did you take me?" Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She shook her head slow. "No," she said. "I didn't take you. I kept you." The way she said it, like those two things weren't the same. I waited. She looked down at her hands. "He brought you to me," she whispered. "A man. Said your mother had died. Said you didn't have anyone. I believed him. I asked, 'What was his name?' She hesitated. He said it was Robert. I don't think that was real. I asked if she ever tried to find out who I really was." Her voice broke on the next sentence. "I was afraid," she said. "I couldn't lose you. I left not long after that. I didn't slam anything. I didn't raise my voice. There wasn't any space for anger in that room, just a kind of hollow understanding that neither of us wanted, but both of us had to stand in." That night, I barely slept. Every few minutes, I'd turn over, eyes open, waiting for something to feel normal again. It didn't come. At dawn, I packed a bag and met Mendoza at the station. He said the Pierces had asked for a private meeting. No cameras, no press, just us. He would drive. The car ride to Nashville took a little over 6 hours. I don't remember most of it. I stared out the window, clutching the photo of the missing boy in my jacket pocket. Not because I needed to see it, but because I needed to feel the weight of it still there. Like it anchored something. We pulled into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Brick homes, trimmed lawns, wind chimes tapping faintly in the breeze. Mendoza cut the engine and gave me a look, one that said I didn't have to go in if I wasn't ready. But I opened the door. The Pierce home was modest, 2 stories, a porch swing out front. A dog barked faintly from a few houses down. I stood there for a moment before knocking. When the door opened, it was her Eleanor Pierce. Older than the photos, but unmistakable. Gray in her hair, tired around the eyes. Behind her stood Thomas, her husband. I didn't speak. I couldn't. She stepped forward slowly. Didn't reach out. just looked at me and said, "Nate." My throat tightened. I said, "I think so." Her hands rose just slightly, then dropped. She stepped in close and rested her forehead against my chest, not crying loud, just breathing there like she'd waited years to exhale. We sat in the kitchen for hours. She brought out photo albums, drawings, cards I didn't remember making. She said I used to collect plastic dinosaurs, that I wanted to be a paleontologist. Thomas said I danced in the hallway when no one was watching, that I hated milk but loved dill pickles. I didn't remember any of it, but each story felt like a pin pressed gently into the map of who I might have been. Then she brought out the last photo ever taken, July 2006. Lake trip. Me in swim trunks holding a red plastic boat. She said I was gone maybe 20 minutes. Thomas had gone to refill the cooler. She turned her back to grab sunscreen. The toy boat had floated back to shore. I hadn't. Later I walked down by the lake myself. Not the same one, just a nearby stretch of water behind the neighborhood. Kids played by the edge. Parents hovered close. I stood a few feet from the shoreline and watched the surface. It looked calm, undisturbed. And then a smell, sunscreen, banana-scented, faint but sharp. And a flash of something, a towel with turtles. Someone shouting my name, arms scooping me up. It was there, and then it wasn't. When I got back, Mendoza had been reading through the case files again. Still no witnesses, no vehicles of interest. Nothing that pointed to how I disappeared, just that I had. But I asked him something I hadn't before. How would someone know where I was that day? He looked up. I said, "Claire said a man brought me to her, but he didn't just find me in the woods. He knew I was gone. He knew who to give me to." That stopped him. He said he'd look into it, try to find the thread. And that's how it began, the part where it all started to come apart for real. Not just the name, not just the timeline, but the whole story underneath, the one someone had gone to a lot of trouble to write. Detective Mendoza called 2 days after I asked that question, said he'd found someone who might be able to fill in a few of the missing blanks. Her name was Lori Benton, a retired park ranger who'd been working Lake Sylvan the summer I disappeared. She'd written one of the earliest incident reports in the case file, and unlike most of the others, she still lived nearby. I drove down to meet them both at a coffee shop off the highway, one of those quiet places with laminate tables and half the booths taped up with duct tape. She was already there when I walked in, sitting at a corner table by the window with a legal pad in her lap. Early 60s gray braid down one shoulder wore her name tag on the inside of her coat. She looked up when I approached, nodded once, and said, "You're him." Not a question. We sat down and Mendoza gave a brief summary of what had been confirmed: my DNA match, the recovered files, the timeline. Then he asked if she remembered anything unusual from that weekend. Lori didn't hesitate. "The lake was packed," she said. 4th of July crowd started early that year. Missing kid reports aren't rare on holidays. Usually they turn up in the snack stand or 2 sites over. But this one felt off, quiet from the start. The family didn't panic the way most do. They froze. She said she remembered Eleanor Pierce standing knee-deep in the water holding that little red boat like it had an answer in it. "I can still see her face," Lori said, like the world had disappeared with him. Then she paused and looked down at her notes. "There was a man I flagged in my initial log," she said. "Camping solo, maybe mid-30s. Claimed he'd seen a boy run into the tree line about 20 minutes before the parents reported him missing. Seemed calm. Too calm. Said he figured the kid would come back. Didn't even offer to help search. Just packed up and left before we got a full ID." Mendoza asked for the name. She didn't look up when she said it. Robert Keller. My chest tightened. I'd heard that name once before from Claire. It was the name she'd given when I asked who brought me to her. Mendoza wrote it down slowly. "We have no confirmed records of a Robert Keller linked to this case," he said. "You sure?" Lori nodded. "That's the name he wrote on his registration slip. Didn't leave a license plate, just cash. But I made a copy of his paperwork just in case. Took it home with me when I retired. You want it?" We did. Later that afternoon, Mendoza called. Said the copy she gave him had one thing on it that wasn't in the original file. In the corner of the registration slip in rushed faint handwriting, there was an emergency contact listed C. Rourke. My stomach dropped. Claire hadn't just been waiting. She'd been part of it. I didn't go over that night. I sat in the apartment and stared at the wall until it got dark. Then I made tea and stared some more. It wasn't that I was shocked she lied. That part had already sunk in. It was realizing that she hadn't just taken me in because someone showed up on her doorstep. She'd known him. She'd been listed as his contact. That changed things. The next day I went to her house. She opened the door like she'd been expecting me. I didn't ask to come in. I held out the paper. "You want to explain this?" She looked at it, then stepped aside. The living room hadn't changed. Same clock ticking too loud. Same blanket folded on the armrest. She sat down slowly and kept her hands in her lap. "I never wanted it to be like this," she said. I didn't sit. I asked again. "Who was he?" She stared at the carpet. His name wasn't Robert. Not really. I met him at a grief group in Jackson. We weren't supposed to talk outside meetings, but we did. She said she was 28, working nights, barely scraping by. He told me he'd lost a sister. Said he understood the ache of being forgotten. Her voice was flat, not rehearsed, just quiet. He didn't act like other people. He talked like someone trying to remember how emotions worked. I asked what he wanted. She said, at first, nothing. He'd just sit with me, talk about how broken the world was, how some kids were better off without the families they came from. She hesitated. He said not all parents were meant to raise children, that sometimes love had to come from somewhere else. I didn't think much of it. Just words. Then one night he came to my door. He was carrying you. Said you'd been left. Said you were in danger. That your mom didn't want you. She looked up at me then. You didn't speak for days. You didn't cry. You didn't ask to go home. I thought maybe he was right. I asked why she never checked, never turned on the news, never filed a report. She just shook her head. I was lonely, she said, and I told myself if something was truly wrong, someone would come looking. No one did. I stood there for a long time before I spoke again. I was 4, I said. I didn't know how to ask. She covered her mouth, eyes filling. I told myself I was giving you a second chance, she whispered. But I see now I stole your first one. I didn't stay. I left the paper on the table and walked out into the fading light. No yelling, no slammed doors. Just quiet. Mendoza called the next morning. Said he'd gotten a match off the name. Robert Keller was an alias. Real name, Gregory Milton. Born in Washington State, moved around a lot, won sealed record for child endangerment in the late 90s, charges dropped, no conviction. Dropped off the radar completely in 2003. But what no one had caught before, what tied it all together, was this. In 2006, just a few months before I disappeared, Gregory had been working as a trainee social worker in Tennessee. He'd met my biological parents during a community outreach event. He offered parenting materials, tried to schedule a follow-up visit. They declined. He never forgot them. When I vanished that July, no one thought to connect the dots. He'd used a different name, a different city. No one ever looked back that far. But Mendoza did. He brought me the report a few hours later. It was thin, only a few pages, but it confirmed what we didn't want to say out loud. My disappearance wasn't random. It wasn't a lost child wandering too far. It was planned, targeted, orchestrated. Gregory had stalked my family, followed us to that lake, waited until the moment was right, and Claire, whether she knew the full story or not, became part of it. When I drove to her house that evening, the lights were off. Her car was gone. The mailbox was empty. I knocked anyway, waited a full minute before checking under the mat. No key, no note, nothing. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun drop behind the trees. The wind chimes knocked around like always, but the sound didn't settle like it used to. When I got back to my apartment, the only thing waiting was silence. No calls, no messages. Just the echo of something unfinished, something still hiding. The days after Claire disappeared felt suspended. I kept expecting some kind of signal, a call, a receipt, a neighbor who'd seen her pack up, but nothing came. Mendoza filed a missing persons report more procedural than urgent. He told me they weren't treating her as a suspect, not yet. Not unless something else turned up. I understood that, but it didn't make the silence feel any less deliberate. I stayed busy the best I could. Work let me take time off, and I used it to sort through everything I'd gathered so far. Flyers, old emails, scanned forms, every photo with a corner torn or date that didn't add up. I even started writing notes in a yellow legal pad just to keep the timelines straight. The more I looked at it all, the more one thing kept circling in my mind. The red toy boat. It had come up in the report, in Eleanor's account, in photos. It was always the last thing seen, the boat drifting back to shore. I'd never questioned that before. But a few nights ago, I pulled out a stack of old birthday pictures Claire had kept in a box under her bed. One was marked 2007. I would have turned 5 that year. In the photo, I'm sitting at a table with a paper crown on, smiling in that blank way little kids do when they're trying to understand what everyone's clapping about. And there, right in front of me on the table, was the red boat. Same scuffed paint. Same white rim along the edge. The one that had supposedly been left behind at the lake. That didn't make sense. Not unless someone took it. Not unless someone brought it back later and placed it in the middle of a new life like a prop. I flipped the photo over. On the back, written in black marker, it said, Nate's New Life, 2007. I sat with that for a long time. The next morning, I drove to the old storage unit where Claire kept things she claimed she didn't have room for. I remembered helping her move some boxes in years back before I even knew what any of this meant. I still had the key on my ring. Most of the contents were old seasonal decorations, legal pads full of phone numbers, expired coupons. But near the back was a blue plastic bin marked House Files. I opened it and found a folder with documents from her move in 2006, lease agreements, utilities, post office forms. Tucked between them was something different. A map. Hand-drawn on faded, lined paper. Not a city map. More like a set of directions. One long road cutting through woods, a left turn by a rock formation, then an X marked near what looked like a stream. In the bottom right corner, a note C, in case you ever forget. The handwriting wasn't Claire's. I brought the map to Mendoza. He stared at it for a while, then pulled out the property records we'd already collected. There was a rental listing under Gregory Milton's alias, same region, a cabin outside of Chattanooga, leased in spring of 2005, then left vacant within a year. Nobody ever followed up because no one knew a child had been there. Mendoza contacted the local authorities and confirmed the structure still stood, though it had never been inspected. He asked if I wanted to go. I said yes before he finished the question. We arrived late morning. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Weather-worn siding, warped boards, moss creeping up the foundation like it had been trying to pull the place underground. The porch steps groaned under our weight. Inside, the air was dense, stale with rot and metal. The first thing I saw was the bed frame, small rusted, still bolted to the floor. A single corner of the mattress remained stained and brittle. There was a broken lantern near the wall, an empty drawer with a missing handle. Mendoza moved slowly through the space, careful not to step on anything that might collapse. In the corner near where the floor dipped slightly, a board creaked under my shoe. I knelt down and pried it loose. Underneath was a shallow cavity lined with torn plastic, and inside was a box. I opened it and froze. Right on top was a photo me asleep curled in a blanket I didn't recognize. I must have been 4. Below that, a notebook. Spiral-bound, the kind you get from a drugstore. Gregory's handwriting filled every page. Stream of consciousness. Ramblings about children and resets about how love could be repurposed if the world refused to deliver it. He never called himself a criminal. He called himself necessary. There was no mention of my name. Just phrases the boy my second chance proof they were wrong. Under the notebook, a crayon drawing. A stick figure holding hands with a taller figure next to a house drawn crooked. On the back of the paper, taped with yellowing Scotch tape, was a note. You were my reset, my proof the world could be rewritten. But they wouldn't understand. No one ever does. I sat down slowly. I don't know how long we stayed there. Mendoza took photos, called it in, arranged for the box to be cataloged as evidence. But I just sat there for a while, not thinking, just absorbing the weight of that space, that someone had stood in this cabin and decided it was where a child would begin again, that they could erase what came before, that the silence would protect them. When we got back to Nashville, Eleanor met me outside the Pierce house. She didn't ask if we found anything. She must have known by my face. She just reached for my hand and squeezed it. That night, we sat on the porch together. Thomas brought out mugs of tea and didn't say much. Later, Carly called to check in. I told her everything. I don't remember what she said, only that her voice shook a little at the end. We didn't hear anything from Claire. No withdrawals, no phone activity, no sightings. It was like she'd disappeared back into the silence she'd lived in for so long. Mendoza said there wasn't enough to press charges yet, not if she didn't reappear, and I didn't know if I wanted that anyway. The kind of closure she could give wasn't something I trusted anymore. But the photo album came a few weeks later. No return address, no note, just a padded envelope left outside my apartment door. Inside was a hand-bound album, each page labeled by year 2006, 2007, 2008. Photos of me growing up in Claire's world. Halloween costumes, school projects, paper crowns. And at the very end, a letter. Just a few lines. I don't know if this redeems me. I don't expect it to. But you were loved, Owen, even in the wrong story. I read it twice, then placed it back in the envelope and left it on the windowsill. That night I dreamed of the cabin again. But this time it was empty, quiet. And when I woke up, I didn't feel pulled back toward it, just away, towards something else I hadn't found yet, something waiting to be uncovered. There was a quiet rhythm to things after the cabin. I'd start each morning the same way, black coffee light's low front window cracked just enough to hear the world wake up. I was back in Asheville, still living above the bookstore, though everything inside felt just a little different now. Familiar objects had taken on a second weight. The chipped mug Claire gave me one Christmas. A worn paperback with her handwriting inside the front cover. I didn't get rid of any of it. I just started noticing. Every object in that apartment had roots in a story I hadn't agreed to, and that included me. Eleanor and Thomas kept in close touch. We didn't overdo it. A call on Tuesday's dinner every other weekend. No pressure. Just a slow rhythm like people relearning how to be part of each other's lives. I appreciated that. Carly would check in too. She kept things lighter, always asking how I was sleeping, sending dumb jokes over text when the news got too heavy. But the truth was, even with the support, I was stuck. The big questions had been answered, but the smaller ones, the ones that claw at you quietly, were still open, and I kept circling the same one. How did he pick me? I brought that to Mendoza one afternoon. We met at his office in Nashville, stacks of file folders around us, the kind of room where the air always smelled like dust and paper. I asked how did Gregory know to find me at the lake that day. Mendoza leaned back, arms crossed, thinking. We know he'd been around the family. The community outreach file confirms he met your parents at a school fundraiser, but that was months earlier. No direct contact after that. No reports. He just vanished. Then you disappear. It's not coincidence, but we don't have the exact line connecting it yet. I nodded, but I could feel something pulling at the edge of that answer. I asked if we'd talked to anyone who was actually on duty at the lake that day aside from Ranger Benton. Mendoza paused, then said there had been another witness listed in the original file, a park staffer who'd submitted a written statement but never followed up. He flipped through a folder until he found it. Lori flagged this too, he said. Here, Lori Benton, July 6th, 2006. Statement received from Park Ranger Lori Benton and Summer Assistant Karen Holloway. Holloway observed a male camper leaving early. Provided no ID. The name didn't jump out at me then. It would later. Mendoza reached out, and 2 days later we drove out to meet her. Karen Holloway lived about an hour outside Chattanooga, now worked at a local intake center that helped rehome people from unstable situations, addiction, domestic violence, homelessness. Her office was tucked into a strip mall next to a dry cleaner and a check cashing place. She was in her 40s now, polite but cautious, like someone who'd learned to measure her words before offering them up. She remembered the lake the day I vanished. I wasn't working the water area, she said. I was stationed near the lower lot where campers came and went. One guy stood out. Not because he was loud, he wasn't, but because he was still. Just watching. She said he sat in a lawn chair for hours, not reading, not eating, just looking toward the trees. He packed up before the news spread, she said. Left early. Said something about traffic. I tried to get his name for the log, but he brushed me off. Mendoza showed her an old photo, Gregory's ID from a previous job. She took one glance and nodded. That's him. Then more quietly. He gave me the creeps. I asked if she remembered anything else. She thought about it, then said, There was a kid. Not yours. Another one. Maybe 7 or 8 years old. Came up to get water from the staff cooler. Said something strange. Asked if the man in the blue jacket was picking up more than one kid. She looked down. I thought it was just something weird kids say. Now I'm not so sure. On the drive back, neither of us said much. Mendoza looked exhausted. I felt it too. We'd spent weeks picking apart something that had already happened, already ended in a way, but every layer kept revealing another wound. That night, I pulled the album Claire had sent me back off the shelf. I flipped slowly year by year, trying not to think, just to look. In the 2009 section, I found something I'd missed before. A small photo, nothing unusual at first glance. Me in the backyard holding a popsicle, one shoe off. But in the corner behind the fence, almost blocked by the edge of the frame, a man. Out of focus. Standing just outside the yard. You couldn't see his face, but the stance was familiar. Hands in pockets. Slight forward lean. Watching. I scanned the photo and sent it to Mendoza. He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, it was short. We'll run it through the system. Don't do anything alone for a while. I didn't ask why. The next morning, I changed the locks on my door. That weekend, Eleanor came to visit. She didn't bring anything, didn't ask questions. Just stood in the kitchen and helped make coffee like she'd done it 100 times. At one point, she reached up to open a cabinet and paused. You ever think, she said, that some people don't want a new life? They just want to control the ending of the last one? I didn't answer right away. But the question stuck. On Sunday night, I took a walk down to the river. Brought the toy boat with me, the same one that had started all of this, the one Gregory had returned to me like a symbol, like a prize. I stood by the edge of the water waiting for the right moment. Then I let it go. It drifted out slow, circling once before the current caught it. I watched until it vanished into the dark, then turned back toward town. I wasn't sure where the next step would lead, but I knew something had shifted. There was more out there. And whatever it was, it hadn't finished with me yet. The week after I released the boat into the river, Mendoza called me into the station. He'd gotten something back on the photo I'd scanned, the one where a man stood just beyond the fence line, barely visible in the background. The image wasn't sharp enough for facial recognition to make a full match, but the software flagged body ratios and posture. It was enough to confirm what we already suspected. It wasn't just someone passing by. It was Gregory, still watching, still close. That photo had been taken in 2009, 3 years after I disappeared. 3 years into the life Claire built around me. He hadn't vanished after the handoff. He'd stayed near like he wanted to see how it all played out, or maybe to make sure I didn't remember. Mendoza pulled a manila envelope from the stack on his desk and slid it toward me. Inside were copies of Gregory's old field notes, the ones we'd found at the cabin. Most of it was incoherent, but there were 2 pages we hadn't spent much time on. One was a sketch of a house layout, kitchen, hallway, back room, and next to it a list of names. Half were crossed out. One was circled. Claire. At the bottom he'd written something that didn't make sense at first, just a number 28, and next to it beds accounted for. I asked if Mendoza had any idea what that meant. He didn't answer right away. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. We've been cross-referencing facility names tied to Milton's known aliases. Nothing solid yet, but there is one we've been watching. He tapped the file. It's a residential rehab program in Idaho. Remote property. Low oversight. Registered under a woman named Margaret Harrow. But we've had reports intake records not matching release numbers. State officials flagged it last year, but nothing came of it. No criminal complaints. I looked down at the folder. You think it's connected? He hesitated, then nodded. I think it's possible that Gregory wasn't acting alone. The facility was called the House of Grace. No website, no marketing, just a P.O. box and a list of rotating staff. Mendoza reached out through official channels, and 2 days later, we flew out to Boise, rented a car, and drove into the mountains. The road was narrow and unmarked in places, no cell signal. The building itself sat on a sloped clearing, a long, low structure with a white cross painted on the side and a porch that wrapped all the way around. It didn't look like a place where anything bad would happen, which is probably the point. A woman greeted us at the gate, mid-50s, wearing a sweater too heavy for the weather. She introduced herself as Karen Holloway. My stomach dropped. It was the same Karen who'd worked the lake that day in 2006, the same one who said she saw Gregory leave, but now she was working here. I didn't know what that meant, and Mendoza didn't let it show on his face. She didn't seem to recognize me. Inside the place was quiet. Too quiet. No chatter, no footsteps, no indication of how many people lived there. Karen gave us a brief tour, common room, chapel, dining area. All very clean, very controlled. Mendoza asked to see the intake logs. She said the director would have to approve that. Her tone didn't leave room for negotiation. The director's name wasn't Margaret Harrow anymore. She went by Sister Grace. And when she finally came down to meet us, something about her presence changed the air in the room. Calm, measured, but not warm. She spoke in clipped sentences, carefully rehearsed, the kind of person who knew how to move a conversation without ever answering the question directly. Mendoza handled most of the talking. I watched. Observed her hands, her posture, the way she kept glancing toward a hallway we hadn't walked down. Eventually, she agreed to let us view a few intake forms. They were redacted, barely useful. Mendoza pressed. She refused to release more without a warrant. We didn't have one. Not yet. We left empty-handed, but before we reached the car, one of the younger staff, a woman maybe in her 20s, caught up with us in the parking lot. She didn't give her name, just slipped Mendoza a small envelope and said, "He used to send her letters." Then she walked away. Inside the envelope was a photo and a cassette tape. The photo showed the same room layout as Gregory's sketch. Same chipped paint on the floor. Same bunk beds. And sure enough, 28 beds lined up in 2 rows. No windows. The tape was labeled in ballpoint pen for the one who remembers. Mendoza found a recorder and played it back in his office. The audio was poor. Static low hums and then a voice, Gregory's. Calm. Slow. "My name is Lily Saunders," he said in a higher-pitched tone. "I live at 42 Brentwood Lane. My dog's name is Buddy. He has a red collar. He's afraid of thunder. My name is Lily Saunders." Then silence, a pause, a breath. Gregory's voice again. "You're doing so well. Just one more time." It played on a loop after that. We ran the name. Lily Saunders had gone missing from Eugene, Oregon in 2011. Age 6. Disappeared during a family picnic. Never found. I stared at the floor, thinking about the number 28. If Gregory had been involved in more than just my case, if this wasn't isolated, if he had moved children through a network disguised as care, then everything we thought we knew about his intentions, his patterns, was incomplete. This wasn't about obsession anymore. This was infrastructure. Mendoza filed the findings with the federal task force that handles trafficking leads. The House of Grace was flagged for investigation. Sister Grace or Margaret Harrow hadn't been seen since. She vanished 2 days after our visit. Karen Holloway cooperated. She admitted she'd been recruited through church work, said she didn't know what the program really was. Whether that's true, I don't know. What I do know is this: I wasn't the only child whose story was rewritten. I wasn't the only one with a red boat or a blue room or a name they were taught to forget. Later that week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a postcard. A photo of a Kansas cornfield. On the back, 3 symbols drawn in pen, 3 interlocking circles. I didn't recognize them at first. But when I flipped through the last pages of Gregory's notebook, I found the same symbol next to a sentence I hadn't noticed before. The Reclamation Network always finds the forgotten. I brought it to Mendoza. He didn't say anything at first. Then he underlined one word. Always. That's when I realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The FBI took over the case formally 3 days after the postcard arrived. Mendoza stepped back into an advisory role but stayed on with full access to the files. It had taken years, but now there were names, places, a paper trail, and something that could finally be followed. They'd located 2 more facilities, one in Nebraska and another in Utah, both rural, both linked by shell charities connected to Margaret Harrow. Or Sister Grace, as she called herself. They also found a list of financial transfers tied to Gregory Milton going back as far as 2002. Most of the accounts were closed or buried under false names, but the transaction descriptions were specific referrals, intake bonuses, medical costs. Words that didn't belong in any kind of foster system. One entry was labeled Reset Kit NP. The initials hit like a punch to the chest. They were mine. Claire was arrested outside of Asheville 2 weeks after the investigation widened. She didn't resist. According to Mendoza, she looked almost relieved. She admitted to falsifying guardianship records and said Gregory had told her I was the child of an addict who'd abandoned me. She claimed she never asked for proof, just wanted to raise someone right. She said I knew it was a lie the first time he handed me your drawings. But I told myself it didn't matter, that you were better off. I don't know if she believed that. I'm not sure she even knows anymore. The court charged her with kidnapping obstruction and conspiracy, but she took a deal. She gave a full statement, turned over every document, photo, and possession tied to me, including a box I'd never seen before. Inside was a red sweater, a worn-out sneaker with the initials NP inside the tongue, and a plastic toy boat. The original one, the one I must have lost. She'd kept it all, tucked away in a trunk at the back of her closet. Maybe guilt, maybe insurance, maybe both. Gregory wasn't found in any of the locations. But they did uncover a property near Sandpoint, Idaho, tied to one of his old aliases. When federal agents searched it, they found a crawl space under the floorboards with a locked metal drawer. Inside was a notebook. Not like the others, this one was clean organized. Labeled entries. Intake dates, behaviors, reassignments. No names, just numbers. 28 entries. Some were stamped with red X's. Next to mine, number 14, was a single phrase. Too much memory in the imprint. Discarded for private reassignment. I sat with that line for a long time. Discarded made it sound like I wasn't worth the trouble. Private made it worse. It meant I wasn't supposed to go through the system at all. I'd been pulled aside, given, kept, repurposed. That's the word Mendoza used. They weren't just erasing children. They were reassigning them, designing lives that couldn't be traced. Karen Holloway agreed to testify. Her account filled in gaps no one else could. She confirmed that Gregory referred to himself as a broker, someone who matched unwanted children to suitable receivers. She said he operated mostly under the radar but kept detailed routines. Every child had a list of habits they were trained into. Favorite foods, bedtime routines, backstories. For the one assigned to Claire, he wrote that, "I loved building towers, hated dogs, liked blueberry pancakes. I don't remember those things. I don't know if any of them were real. That's what unsettles me more than anything, the not knowing what parts were mine and what parts were programmed." The media caught wind of it not long after the charges were filed. They called it a trafficking ring, though it didn't resemble the ones most people picture. No chains, no cages, just documents, soft words, forged custody papers, and people who looked like volunteers. The Reclamation Network, as the files called it, operated under layers of churches, nonprofits, and youth outreach programs. They used language about healing, redemption, restoration. But underneath it all was a system that turned lost children into clean slates for people who wanted them on their own terms. The motive wasn't always money. Sometimes it was ideology. Sometimes it was grief. Sometimes it was just control. In one of the intake reports from the Utah property, there was a note scribbled in the margin. "Ask about the dog." That's all it said. 4 words. But it brought me back to that night when I showed up in the backyard in Eugene and asked about Buddy. The same phrase. Same confused look on Clyde's face when I said it. I think that's how they tested whether a child's conditioning held, by seeing if the false memories stuck after the reset. That one didn't. Not for me. Buddy was real. They couldn't take that. At Claire's sentencing, I was asked if I wanted to give a statement. I declined. Not out of mercy, but because nothing I said would make the outcome cleaner. She received 8 years with eligibility for parole. Karen received 5 and is currently in witness protection under another name. Gregory Milton, whose real name is still under investigation, remains at large. But there's an Interpol notice now, and 3 former associates have been indicted on related charges. After the courtroom cleared, Mendoza handed me a padded envelope. "Came in yesterday," he said. "No return address." Inside was a photograph. It showed a child standing near a rusted mailbox in a wide field. Kansas again. Same postcard scene. But in the lower corner, faint and almost hidden, were the initials LS scratched into the wood post. Lily Saunders. She's out there. Somewhere. Or maybe someone else saw her and sent the photo as a sign. Either way, it felt like a thread not closed but not broken either. I took the photo home and placed it in a drawer next to the toy boat. Not to forget, but to remember properly. On the back of the photo, in the same handwriting as before, were the words, "We're still watching." This time I didn't read it as a threat. I read it as a promise. I still think about the boy they called Nate, and the boy I used to be before that name was ever given to me. Some days I feel like I'm walking through 2 stories at once, one that happened to me, and one I had to build on top of the wreckage. Memory's a fragile thing. You'd think it would get sharper once the truth comes out, but that's not how it works. Some details come back in flashes, the way the lake smelled in summer, the burn of that sunscreen on my face, the sound of a lock clicking shut in the dark. But others never come. Not fully. There are still years I can't reach, days I only know through someone else's notes. The house in Asheville is gone. Claire sold it to pay restitution. I haven't seen her since sentencing, though she did send a letter. It wasn't an apology exactly, more like a confession dressed in justification. She wrote that I was the best thing that ever happened to her, that she still believes she saved me even if it wasn't her place to do it. I read it once, then put it away. I don't need to hate her, but I'm not going to carry her guilt either. Detective Mendoza retired not long after the case closed. He sent me a photo of the red boat, the one they found in storage, the one I used to play with floating again. He'd taken it back to the lake in Tennessee and set it down in the water. No fanfare, no press, just him and a quiet morning. He said, figured it deserved a chance to drift. That stayed with me, the way he phrased it. A chance to drift. The real surprise came a year later when I got an email from someone named Megan Saunders. Her message was careful, respectful. She said she wasn't sure if I'd want contact, but that she had always kept the porch light on. That was the phrase she used. We left it on in case he ever found his way home. Her son Jonah had seen my photo on a local news segment about recovered identities. Recognized something in the eyes. It took months of slow conversations, cross-checks, and DNA confirmation. And even then, it didn't feel real. But it was. They'd never stopped looking. Not really. There was a box in their attic full of missing posters, sketches, a scrapbook with every birthday marked. His name was Owen, they told me. Owen Granger. That was my name before it was taken. They didn't ask me to go back to it. They didn't ask for anything. They just wanted to tell me about the boy they lost and let me decide who I wanted to be now. I still go by Nate. It's the name I grew up with, even if it came from the wrong place. But I keep both names close. Two truths held together, not competing, just coexisting. One for the life I survived, one for the one I reclaimed. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. These stories aren't always easy to carry. But they matter, because for everyone that gets told, there's another child out there who might still be waiting to be found. So, if this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name gets left behind.